Hello or namaste. Welcome to Atypical Dikkate, a conversation podcast. I'm your host Soumya. This podcast is not just a repository of stories and experiences, but it is also a journey to build solidarity, queer intimacy, and a community while highlighting neglected issues including sexual and reproductive health and rights. Today, I have Amna with me. Amna is a Pakistani feminist activist, media scholar, and communications practitioner currently based in Sydney, Australia. Her work explores socio-political feminist movements across South Asia, focusing on how digital media, activism, and cultural politics intersect to shape gendered social change. She currently leads communications at Noor, a feminist think and do tank. Hello, Amna. Lovely to have you here.
Hi, Soumya, and thank you so much for having me. It's truly an honor.
Not a lot of people know, but Amna and I, we go way back. We met in 2018 at our master's program in Sydney. So it's like a catch up between friends as well.
Absolutely.
I'll jump right into it. Amna, disability, we have spoken about it at length, in our private spaces. Disability is often portrayed as a single unified category, yet lived experiences vary greatly across pain, chronic illness, dynamic, and invisible disabilities. How should we rethink what disability is when considering these diverse experiences and realities according to you?
yeah, I I think for me, rethinking disability starts with recognizing that what you just said, it isn't one fixed or unified experience. In the last few years, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, epilepsy, and I'm also neurodivergent. And even within my own body, disability doesn't show up in one consistent way. Some days I can function almost normally, and on other days, being fatigue or seizures shape everything I can or cannot do on that particular day or even that week. That kind of fluctuation alone challenges the idea that disability is something visible, stable, or easily categorized or easily something that can be cataloged under a certain category. So rather than asking who counts as disabled, quote unquote, it's more useful to understand disability as a relationship between bodies and barriers. And I think a medical diagnosis might describe what's happening in somebody's body, but disability itself is produced by inaccessible systems, stigma, and the way society responds to difference. And when we take these diverse realities seriously, disability stops being the label that some people fit in and others don't. Instead, it becomes like a political category, if you may, that helps us understand how pain and chronic illness, as well as mental health, neurodivergence, and shifting capacities all sort of intersect with structures of care and labor, as well as gender and power. And then it pushes us to design a world that supports all kinds of bodies, not just the ones that function in a predictable or in a socially acceptable way.
It is a political term. It also helps us connect with each other, build that community, and also sort of like, in a way, build that solidarity and unionize. Because otherwise, we live isolated lives, which makes it difficult for us to access resources. And also, like you said, it's a political tool. It makes it, when we don't have that community, that solidarity, that language, it makes it difficult for us to come together to even stand up for our rights. As a follow up question, delving a little more deeper into the SRHR aspect, what does reproductive justice mean when viewed through the lens of disability justice? And what might a disability justice oriented SRHR framework look like in practice?
Thanks, Soumya. That's a really well framed question. Yeah, I think reproductive justice, when viewed through a disability justice lens, is really about expanding the idea of bodily autonomy. I think it's not just the right to contraception or abortion, it's the right to parent and to form relationships, to make decisions about our bodies and to receive care with dignity and to live without surveillance or coercion. Disabled people have historically been denied all of these, right? So from forced sterilization and being deemed unfit, quote unquote, to parent, and to clinics that are inaccessible, to the routine dismissal of our pain, fatigue, or mental health. So, yeah, I think disability justice pushes reproductive justice to recognize what autonomy doesn't mean that autonomy doesn't mean much if the world itself is not accessible or trusting of disabled bodies. And in practice, a disability justice oriented SRHR framework is one where people are believed when they describe pain or fatigue. And even when the medical files may not show neat answers, it's where clinics are physically, cognitively, and sensory accessible, and where care is trauma informed. So, that could mean accounting for things like seizures, chronic pain, neurodivergence, or previous medical trauma. And, it's where also sex education actually includes disabled bodies and disabled player, and where providers understand that conditions can flare or fluctuate without undermining an individual's autonomy. And I think it's also like a framework where disabled people are supported in parenting rather than judged through an ableist lens, and where mental health is seen as an inseparable, entity from reproductive well-being. So ultimately, I think disability justice reminds us that reproductive justice isn't just about individual choice, quote unquote. It's about making sure people have the conditions that make choice possible in the first place, and that includes access, rest, safety, support network, economic stability, and the experience of being believed, which I cannot even stress how rare I think that is, especially in that medical framework. So when SRHR systems are designed with the most marginalized bodies in mind, those of us with fluid and invisible or chronic disabilities, the entire system then becomes more humane and more effective and impactful for everyone involved.
This reminds me of something. I know someone who has epilepsy, and at one point when they were looking for, like, the family was actually looking for marriage and those, prospective partners, etc. One of the things that was being discussed at that time is they should hide that they have this diagnosis. And it just reminds me how the burden, the shame is often put on the person who is already facing those challenges. And it sort of like perpetuates that oppression inside the community, inside their homes. And then ultimately, like, already the systems are exclusive, they are not disability friendly. And how it sort of like magnifies in partnerships, in relationships, and in healthcare systems. So your experiences sort of like reminded me of that. I just have one follow up question. You mentioned like how disabled parents, there needs to be some support system for disabled parents. Do you have any ideas on what that support might look like when it comes to SRHR for disabled parents?
As I'm a parent myself, and I think a lot of disabled parents are making decisions about pregnancy, fertility, or parenting in a context where there's often, an underlying assumption that they shouldn't be doing those things in the first place, right? And there's always a lot of judgment involved. People think they're selfish, they're, acting irresponsibly, even. And of course, like that doesn't always get said directly, but it shows up in how people are spoken to and what information is offered and how seriously their choices are taken. So, yeah, and I think parenting is still such a heteronormative and such like an ableist space. Like that's how it's envisioned, even, as we talk about it. It is a space that is increasingly, I think, also getting heteronormative due to this, far right wave, but also ableist, right? Like if you are a disabled parent and you've chosen to have to bring, a child into this world, you are a lot of times deemed to be irresponsible and acted out of carelessness. So yeah, I mean, so instead of being supported through open-ended conversations, people often find themselves having to justify their decisions and again and again, and sometimes that means going to multiple providers, healthcare providers, just to get balanced information, or having to push back against a discouragement in clinical settings or even in like societal settings, even in friendlier settings. So, because of that, I think informal networks become really important then. Friends, partners, disability communities, online spaces, all of the spaces where people can actually hear lived experiences that reflect their realities and not just assumptions. And a lot of it is also just ongoing internal work. I think personally, thinking through what support is available, how symptoms or energy levels might change, what kind of care structures exist around us. It's really a simple yes or no decision. It's more, something people navigate over time and in relation to our bodies and our circumstances. So, yeah, I think the reality is that people aren't just making these decisions in isolation, they're making them in systems that don't always expect or fully support disabled people as parents while still trying to make grounded choices about their own lives. So, yeah, I think in terms of support, I think what I just mentioned, personally, I think hearing from people who have had those lived experiences and being in communities, supportive communities, is the biggest support one can get.
Absolutely. You mentioned how disability justice or like the rights of disabled people is also being affected within these developing far right regimes. So, focusing a little on that, so how do structural forces, even modesty norms, pathologization of desire, and power asymmetries, including this shift towards right wing regimes in the world that we are living in, how does all of this shape individual agency and access to sexuality for disabled people?
Yeah, structural forces shape disabled people's agency around sexuality long before any individual choice is made, right? And of course, those structural forces are influenced by anti rights, anti gender ideologies, and movements. Take modesty norms, for example. In many communities, modesty becomes a kind of social currency. Disabled people, especially women and gender diverse people, are often expected to embody like a very strict version of it, a stricter version of it, if I may, in order to be seen as respectable, quote unquote, or good. And that pressure can limit access to information, to safe conversations, or to the space to understand our own bodies and needs without feeling watched or judged. And then there's the demonization of desire. Disabled people are often cast in between extremes. They're either too vulnerable to be interested in relationships or somehow asexual by default. When any expression of desire or curiosity is treated as inappropriate or worrying, it becomes much harder to explore intimacy in healthy, supportive ways. So then sexuality in those instances becomes something that is either denied or that very tightly controlled by the state, by the society, or by a community that you're in. And this can create shame and confusion rather than confidence and autonomy. And power asymmetries, as you were talking about, Soumya, deepen these limitation and constraints. Many disabled people rely on their family, their partners, carers for mobility and for financial support, or even like just daily. And that dependence can make it risky to express preferences or to form relationships or even assert boundaries when the people who control access to care, may not approve. So agency in such cases exists, like it exists generally, but it's constantly negotiated within those unequal conditions. And all of this means that disabled people's access to sexuality isn't just about individual empowerment. It's about the structural environment around us. It's, modesty expectation and stigma, taboos, and unequal power shape what feels possible or safe. So real agency for disabled people, sexual agency for disabled people requires shifting the structure, be it cultural, social, or material, so that, they can explore intimacy and connection on their own terms without shame, fear, or surveillance shaping every decision that they're taking in their life.
Amna, two things really stood out to me. One is definitely like disabled people, either they are seen like they are vulnerable, or like we are infantilized, or sort of like we are desexualized completely. And that sort of also like conflates asexuality and desexualization. One is a sexual orientation, and the other is, you are taking away, stripping them of their agency. So that bit is absolutely true. And it comes up again and again in my conversations. And the other interesting bit was definitely how modesty sort of like acts as a social currency in our world. Like people who carry themselves in a certain way, which sort of like adheres to the narrative that is already there in the society, which is like the acceptable form, which makes you acceptable in the society. And that sort of like also gives you that currency which makes it easier for you to navigate in the world. But when you sort of like defy that traditional outlook of what you should be like, especially more so if you are like a queer person or like a woman, if you defy those boundaries, then it becomes even more difficult for you to navigate this world. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Completely agree.
Going ahead, like people with mental health conditions, how are reproductive decisions and support needs misunderstood or neglected by medical systems? Do you have any examples to sort of like highlight this?
Yeah, for people with mental health conditions, one of the biggest issues is that reproductive decisions are often misunderstood as if mental health and reproductive health are separate things, right? When in reality, they're completely entangled. So how someone is feeling mentally or emotionally shapes everything, right? From whether they feel safe making certain decisions to how they experience pregnancy, medication, hormones, or even navigating care systems in the first place. And the problem is that the system often responds with caution or with, control rather than support. Instead of being asked, what do you need to make this work for you? People are more likely to be asked, are you sure you can do this? Are you sure you can cope? Are you sure this is the right thing? So like a lot of those questions that can further confuse someone. And that shift might sound subtle, but it changes how your agency is seen. It stops, kind of being support and becomes more of a suspicion. It feels like you're not being trusted or you're not being, you're not being supported in a way. So there's a lot of misreading going on, right? Like things like anxiety and trauma responses, fatigue, or dissociation can get interpreted as someone being unstable or unreliable, or which means their actual needs, their needs like needing more time in appointments or need for a clear communication pattern or continuity of care. All of those can get overlooked. And with medication, especially in pregnancy related care, people are often given very blunt advice without much nuance, right? Like blunt and if I can also say sometimes insensitive advice under the guise, oh, we can sugarcoat. This is medical advice. It needs to be as blunt as possible. So, and this can leave people feeling like they're choosing between stability and reproductive decision making rather than being supported through both. So, yeah, from a disability justice perspective, I think the issue isn't that people with mental health conditions cannot make those decisions. It's that the system isn't built to actually support those decisions in a way that's informed and, in a way that's flexible and non-judgmental. So, a lot of what gets framed as risk is really just, unmet support needs, I think.
While I was listening and reflecting on all the episodes we have done so far, I think during all the discussions, we could never really reach the point where we could discuss something like what does prenatal care look like for disabled people? Or, like, even after the pregnancy is done and the child is here in the world, what does that care look like for a disabled parent or disabled parents? We could never really get there because there are so many barriers when it comes to accessing that SRHR service. I think this is only the first time where we are sort of like nudging or starting to have a conversation about that. So I would like to focus a bit more on that. So how do cultural and social attitudes in your experience around disability influence access to reproductive education, fertility guidance, or prenatal care?
Yeah, thanks, Soumya. I think one of the reasons why it's so hard to envision these possibilities and there's so many barriers, and I think it's because there is no framework, there's no imagination of alternative realities for folks when it comes to prenatal care or fertility guidance or reproductive education. So I think cultural and social attitude around disability shape access to reproductive care long before someone even gets into a clinic, right? I'm a big believer in that. And a big part of it is assumptions. If disability is seen through a lens of dependency or infantilization, people are often assumed not to need reproductive education in the first place. So they're left entirely out of, sex education or given very generic, general, non-specific information that doesn't actually include their bodies or their realities, right? And it's not relevant to them even. And that then carries into healthcare. Disabled people are sometimes not taken seriously when they ask for fertility information or clinical care, or there's an unspoken idea that pregnancy or parenting might not be the, quote unquote, right fit for them, the right choice for them. So instead of open, supportive guidance, people can end up meeting hesitation, lots of gatekeeping, or just like subtle discouragement, even. So even when care is technically available, stigma still shows up in really everyday ways. Like, not being given enough time in appointments or not having things explained properly or just having symptoms brushed off. I've had that experience myself. And when I say that, I would also like to back that up that especially for people with invisible or fluctuating disabilities, there's also this constant pressure to prove what your experience is real enough to be taken seriously. That's something that I've experienced myself so many times. So, and this onus is always on us to prove that you cannot see that there's something going on inside of me, and I have this pain in this particular part of my body, and you see me as a functioning individual traveling, working, parenting, but there, I really do need support and care. So yeah, it's not just about services existing, it's about whether disabled people are actually seen as people who are entitled to the same information, care, and yeah, possibilities and realities as anybody else out there.
That people don't even pause to think that there can be an alternative possibility. There's a certain bias framework that exists in in people's head that okay, this is what a disabled person should look like, this is what they do. That possibility doesn't even exist in most people's heads, including our healthcare practitioners. Amna, if you are comfortable, because epilepsy is a misunderstood diagnosis, if you are comfortable, before I delve into the next question, if you could help us explain what does it look like for you? And the position that I'm coming from is how, because of this lack of awareness, a lot of people in cultural taboos exist, social taboos exist, and it's sort of like linked sometimes with hysteria, and more so if you are like a woman, and in places where where there is not a lot of awareness, etc. People sort of like say it or like use terms such as mata aa gayi hai, those kinds of things that exists in India. So could you like help us understand a bit what does epilepsy mean, and then like how do disability specific challenges like you have been mentioning, chronic fatigue, pain management, how have they intersected with reproductive health appointments and follow-ups in your experience?
Yeah, of course. If I talk about this personally, I think for me, because I have only been diagnosed with all of these things very recently within the last 2 to 3 years, I do have memory of, hearing certain things about certain people growing up. Their parents must have done something for their child to suffer like that. So there's a lot of stigma, criminalization of sorts as well when it comes to disabled bodies and what somebody could have done for them to be for their children to be born in a disabled body or for their children to be met with such fate, if you may. Personally, for me, disability epilepsy looks quite different from other people that I know. Because, like I said, I got diagnosed very like recently, much later in my life, after I was a mom, after I was at a certain point in my life. So it came as a surprise, like completely something that I was, never happened to me before. It took me by surprise. And one day my reality had changed, but goes without saying that whenever I do tell people that this is the new reality that of my life, it is met with a lot of surprise, a lot of, like, how did this happen? What happened? But, there's a lot of confusion around it. Yeah. I mean, so for me, like understanding epilepsy is an ongoing journey. I still don't completely understand it. Also because I have absolutely no symptoms, right? Like in terms of physiologically, I have zero symptoms. I can be absolutely okay 1 minute, and then next I could just faint for a couple of seconds. So there's nothing, there's no sort of build up in between those two realities. Accepting this new reality has been extremely cathartic. Oh, but just to say, yeah, just, accepting my new body, my this new reality has been cathartic. And that's the only way forward. At least for myself, like that's the only way I think I can, proceed and do well in life. And then going on to your question about, the specific challenges like pain management and how those intersect with reproductive health appointments. I think, and I'll talk about this more generally because I don't have very specific personal experience here, but I think disability specific challenges like chronic fatigue or pain don't sit outside of reproductive health. Yeah, they shape how people are able to access it in, very practical ways. But most systems are still built around an assumption of a standard body that can show up on time, that can sit through long appointments, and that can come back for multiple follow-ups without much disruption. And for someone living with a chronic fatigue or with chronic illness or chronic pain, that model can be really difficult. A single appointment could might take days of planning and recovery, plus the travel, waiting in rooms, those sensory environments, long consultations can all add up in ways that aren't always visible to people, to medical professionals. So even when care is technically available, the structure of it can make access uneven and exhausting. So follow-ups can also become a barrier. Multiple appointments might be clinically necessary, but practically they might be unsustainable for someone who's managing fluctuating energy or pain levels. So that's where people sometimes fall through the gaps, not because they don't want access to care, but just because the system doesn't always adapt to how their bodies actually function over time. So, and in terms of what helps, I think flexibility helps. Longer appointments when needed help. Remote options where possible help. Continuity of care so people don't have to re-explain themselves each time is really helpful. And when medical professions who understand that capacity isn't fixed, that's really helpful from my own experience. So from a disability justice perspective, it's really about designing reproductive healthcare that accounts for fluctuation and rest and unpredictability as normal and not something exceptional, and definitely not something that they're doing as a favor to certain
Again, one of the things that you said is going to stayed with me is how healthcare is sort of visualized for a certain type of body, not for all bodies. And this reminded me of, again, some conversations I have been having, like how, intrauterine contraceptive devices, when they are inserted, and speculums, a device called speculum is often used to keep the vagina open while that is being inserted. And people who have disabilities or have challenges when it comes to pain management, etc., no thought is given to them. And sometimes even like healthcare professionals say that, oh, we don't have any pain management drugs, which makes the process even more like traumatic for the individual who is seeking that care.
I agree. Yeah, it's yeah, these systems aren't designed for people who have needs that don't fit into that standard framework. It's not so radical to demand that and to imagine alternatives and to not just imagine, put those in alternatives into practice. So what you've said, yeah, completely resonates. There is no thought when you go into like a clinic or, any contraceptive or something. Yeah, there's not even a thought that comes to mind there. So yeah.
Amna, one of the questions that I had for you, especially because you work more within like how these socio-political feminist movements are working currently with the shift towards, right-wing regime, etc. Just like briefly, what do you think is, the current situation when it comes to ASRHR, like globally, especially with your work and everything? How is it moving? some particular specific challenge that you think is like the need of the hour that needs all of our attention? Would just love to hear your perspective on everything that's been happening.
Yeah. There's so honestly, unfortunately, there's so much to unpack in this one question. But I think, as we all know, and as we can all see, there's a regression when it comes to SRHR conversations, topics, rights are being, are being pushed across board around the world. We're seeing rise of fascist actors, fascist governments, fascist ideologies are rising, and their first target is always the bodies and autonomy of women and gender diverse folks, and that's where they're sort of focusing and centering their focus to begin with. I think generally there's a rollback when it comes to the rights of women and gender diverse people around the world. That one particular area would be abortion rights. And as we can see it across board, there have been lots of conversations happening from, the anti-right actors and movements where they're trying to overturn the rights that are already in place or have been. We have seen that in the US already, and it's increasingly happening around the world. So yeah, there's a rollback which is very concerning and something that we should all be thinking about and having conversations about. And also, I think thinking how this impacts all of us across movements and across contexts. Like this is not, SRHR is not one thing and not something that only a particular group of people should be concerned about or a particular group of social justice activists should be concerned about. This is something that impacts people working on climate, people working on democracy, people working on economic rights, on land. SRHR intersects with all of these other thematics across boards, across movements, across regions. So, yeah, it's something for all of us in the ecosystem to look at, to think about, to have conversations about.
Absolutely. And this is something which really surprised me till date how sometimes when we are advocating for certain things, we only speak about one thing. But a war also causes, long-term damage to our climate. It also leads to challenges with regards to disability justice. It creates challenges for SRHR services, women and menstruating people, or like who are pregnant people. They don't have access to healthcare services. They don't even have access to clean water and menstrual hygiene products, and that is a human right. It's sometimes like sometimes it just bogs me down how when we talk about certain issues we talk about them in silos and we don't look at the whole picture. So absolutely we can't win any fight when we keep ourselves siloed. Everything intersects with each other and we don't live any single issue lives. So absolutely resonate with what you said. Amna, any parting thoughts you have before we wrap this up?
Yeah, thanks, Soumya. I think the key thing that I always come back to is that people with disabilities or people with chronic illnesses are always, and already making these decisions every day about their lives, about their reproductive health, about, their right to reproduce. And they're just, doing it in systems that don't always recognize them as fully entitled beings who can make those decisions. So the question really isn't whether disabled people are capable of these choices. They are. It's apparent. It's the question is it's what would need to change for those choices to actually be supported, to be respected, and to be made easier. And if we center that, if we center support, if we center access, if we center belief, then we end up building systems that are better, not just for disabled people, not just for people with chronic illnesses, with invisible disabilities, but systems that are better and functional for literally everybody out there.
Absolutely, 100%. And I was just sort of like thinking, like, when you make things accessible, it ultimately benefits everyone and not just one section of the society. Sometimes, like, when we are talking about like reasonable accommodations, even in workplaces, or having like closed captions, originally closed captions, it was started like to support people who have like hearing impairments. But when we have like attention challenges, like that comes with ADHD or even like brain fog, a lot of people actually had that during COVID. Closed captions sort of like help you actually focus on the thing, and it makes the video more accessible to everyone. So absolutely. Yeah, it was a lovely conversation, lot of food for thought. Thank you again, Amna, for taking out the time.
Thank you for having me, Soumya. Like I said, it's always, such a pleasure talking to you generally. And thank you for having me on your very fantastic podcast. I love Atypical Dikkate, and I'm very proud to be featured here. So
Oh, thanks again so much. If you're hearing this message, you have listened to the entire episode, so thanks so much for sticking around. You can listen to Atypical Dikkate on your choice of podcast platform. And if you want to reach out to me, your host Soumya, check out the Linktree link in the description. See ya!